us and all who are gathered for Bible study. Sorry we're a minute or two late. I forgot to bring the camera. Pastor James has been setting us up, so we're all good to go on this snowy and frigid February day. We've been looking at some really tough texts in Genesis, and they really get to the heart of, is God a nice God or a mean God, a just God or a not just God? And if you remember about chapters ago, after God promised the birth of Isaac, this is when it all starts happening, these questions. Because God decides to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And he includes Abraham in that discussion with the two angels. And remember, Abraham even has this discussion, well, if there's 50 righteous people, would you still wipe away the 50 righteous with the wicked? And God's like, no, I wouldn't do that. So you have this sort of bartering of how many people would God allow to survive, how God would allow a wicked city to survive if how many righteous people were still alive in that city. And the answer pretty much comes down to there's not enough. And yet God does save Lot, who is a lot of trouble. And, you know, people have asked me before, is Lot in heaven? I don't know. God does have mercy on Lot, for sure. He spares him. His wife disobeys the spoken word and looks at the glory of God, and she turns into a pillar of salt. Lot's daughters end up getting him drunk, and they have kids with their dad. Moab, which means from the father, and the Ben Ami, which means son of my people, I believe. So the Ammonites and the Moabites, who end up becoming not good neighbors to Israel, not good neighbors to the sons and daughters of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but wicked people. God ends up destroying them too. So you have that, and then you have God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. And then last week in chapter 20, we had Abraham meeting Abimelech, who is this sort of king of the Negev, which is south in a dry, arid land. Abraham again tells this king, like the king in Egypt, that Sarah is his sister. And so God, Abimelech takes Sarah as a wife. He doesn't sleep with her yet. God sort of distracts him from doing so. And in the meantime, God strikes him with the plague and his household. He repents, which is great, and he is spared from any more disaster. But he's angry with Abraham because Abraham lied to him. Abraham said, well, I didn't sort of lie because she's sort of my half-sister. And it just goes again to show that Abraham, even though God's done all this for him throughout this story, this beautiful story, that Abraham's still a piece of work. He still sins, just like you and I do. And we need to live continually in the grace of God. So, but through this, God blesses Sarah and Abraham with more wealth. And so then we get into today, chapter 21 of Genesis. And this is the birth of Isaac. And again, we made this point, I think, last week, that God does not just destroy the wicked because they're wicked. Sometimes God destroys the wicked because they're wicked, and he's a just God, and to protect his plan. So what is his biggest plan? His biggest plan, which is not just about Abraham and Sarah, but it's about you and me, is to bring forth a son, a promised son, who will destroy wickedness completely. Two sons, and from his son, and from his son, and from his son, eventually Jesus will come and crush the serpent's head. And so when you have a wicked Sodom and Gomorrah living just outside the door, the tent of Abraham, who has the promised son, Isaac, you can't let the wickedness get to the son. And so that's another reason, I think, why God had to deal with Sodom and Gomorrah before Isaac's birth. So now we get into chapter 21. The Lord, Yahweh, visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. Notice it's the Lord working. God works through means, obviously, husband and wife, but God is the one making this happen. Remember, it's a miracle. You got a 99-year-old Abraham. When Isaac is born, he'll be 100, and Sarah 90. Verse 2, and Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham and Sarah, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So this is definitely a miracle. There's definitely a change in the pre-flood world where people lived to be 900 years old, they had kids when they were 100 years old, to the post-flood world, which we live in. So Abraham's world was more like our world, where there was famines and natural disasters and definitely genetical problems, which led to things like barrenness, or I won't say necessarily genetical things, but definitely health maladies. Okay, and in this case, we have Sarah who is barren, but God works a miracle. 90 years old is more like our day, which is impossible to have a kid, and she has a kid, and she laughs about it. And Abraham laughed when he first heard about it. So Isaac's name means he laughs. His name will always remind people of God's sort of humor in bringing about his salvation. And so they have a son, they name him Isaac. Notice he's circumcised, so Abraham follows the command that was back, I think, in chapter 16. So the mark of the covenant is on Abraham, and the procreation of Abraham and Sarah brought forth the promised son. So this is all tied together, and the circumcision happens on the 8th day. And so after the fall into sin, God had to sort of recreate us to be new creations. And in the Old Testament, we see that first happening in the covenant of circumcision. And so Isaac is a new creation now on the 8th day, and we are off and running with the next generation, a miracle baby. But that brings a problem. What about Ishmael? Remember, there is another son. And we'll have to get into that. Verse 8. The child grew and he was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So laughter is definitely a theme from here on out. In fact, when I wrote 2 books on the book of Genesis. The first book I called Very Good, which covered through the flood, and the second book picks up with Abraham and traces the rest of the book of Genesis through the 3rd generation, Joseph, and their trials in Egypt. I named that book God Laughed, because laughter is a huge theme from the story of Abraham all the way into the Joseph story. And here again, it's not just Abraham and Sarah laughing that they have a kid, but now you have Ishmael laughing, and he's laughing in a mockingly way towards either Sarah or towards Isaac. Verse 10. So she said to Abraham, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. Now we have a mess, but this is what happens when Abraham and Sarah took their God's covenant, God's promise, into their own hands. It's not God's fault. God didn't tell him to do this, and yet God's been patient this whole time. He's been blessing Abraham and Sarah. He did with Isaac. He also blessed Abraham and Hagar with Ishmael, and he's been blessing Ishmael and loving both sides of the family. He did not cause this. Sinful humans, by their free will, caused this. And now Sarah is sinning in not viewing Hagar as she should. The mother of Abraham's other son, whom Sarah chose, it was not an affair, an adulterous affair. And so she sort of belittles Hagar. She's a slave woman. Get rid of her. He has no no right with my son Isaac. That's where Sarah's at. Verse 11, and the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. So Abraham's caught in the middle. He's not happy with this. Ishmael is his beloved son. He's been out hunting with Ishmael. Ishmael's probably 13 years old now, 14. He's at that age where he's becoming a teenager, getting his driver's license, perhaps, and learning how to hunt and make, beef jerky and doing stuff with his dad. And now all of a sudden Sarah wants to get rid of him and his mother. So it's displeasing to Abraham. Verse 12, but God said to Abraham, do not be displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman, so also because he is your offspring. So notice God seems to take Sarah's position, and I don't really think he's taking Sarah's position, but there is a problem and something has to be resolved. And so I think more what God's doing is saying, don't worry about Abraham. Obviously, these two women are at odds, and if you leave this together, it's not going to end well. So don't be afraid to send Hagar away, and I'll take care of Hagar. I'm her God, and I'm Ishmael's God, and I know you're very fond of Ishmael, and I'll take care of Ishmael too. So God is sort of telling Abraham, listen to your wife, and I will make things right because I'm God. Verse 14. So Abraham rose early in the morning. Remember those words for next week. So Abraham rose early in the morning. Usually not good things happen when you rise early in the morning when you're Abraham. And he takes bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and he sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. That's the very south part of Israel. It's a very arid place, not a fun place to go wander. It was probably a very tragic scene to Abraham. He probably was wondering, how is this going to work out? I'm worried for my wife and son. But God made a promise. That's the whole point of the text. It's not that God is endorsing this. It's God saying, all right, you guys made a mess. All right, Abraham, listen to your first wife. I'll protect the son of the promise, Isaac, but I'm also going to protect Hagar and Ishmael. And we see that happen. Verse 15. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. So Hagar pretty much gives up. They drink the water. She puts Ishmael under a tree. He's 14 years old. And she just says, I'm done. We're going to die. And you see this happen a lot of times in the Bible too. I think of Elijah and his pity party where he's to him. And he sits under a broom tree, I think. And then there's Jonah. He sits under plants and wants God to crush Nineveh. After all that God had said and done, Jonah's going to be a pity party. Well, here's Hagar being a pity party, not struggling and not working at it. She just wants to die, let her son die. But verse 17, God heard the voice of the boy. That's key. So the boy has learned something from his dad, and he is a circumcised child of God as well. He is a new eighth-day creation as well. And he must have been praying, which is cool. And he hears the voice of the boy, and the angel of God, the Melech of Yahweh, called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy, and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. Okay, so here we have God appearing to Hagar, the Melech Yahweh, the angel of God, the angel of the Lord. That's pre-incarnate Jesus. And what does he say? He says the same thing that is said to the shepherds when they are filled with great fear. Fear not, the first things. God has heard your voice. He's heard the voice of the boy. And so get up. And then God opened her eyes. It's not that she was blind, but he opens her eyes to see what she couldn't see before because she was having a pity party and not trusting that God was going to do what he said, take care of them. She opens her eyes, and there is a miraculous well of water, if you will. And she's able to get water and keep them alive. And then she finds a wife for Ishmael, and so begins the story of Ishmael and his family. Now, we're going to leave Ishmael's family for much of the Genesis story because the rest of the Bible, it tracks the promise of the son who's going to crush the head of the serpent. But Ishmael's a real good dude, and he's out and about and living, and his family will come back in the story from time to time, not always in a good way. He becomes a father, I believe, of the Amalekites, who is the nation that comes against Israel. They just come out of Egypt. They try to come out and destroy Israel right away. They're cousins, and God is not happy with them for doing that. All right. Back to Abimelech, verse 22. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, said to Abraham, God is with you in all that you do. Now, therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me, or with my descendants, or with my posterity. But as I have dealt kindly with you, so also deal with me and with the land where you have sojourned or wandered. And Abraham said, I will swear. So when Abraham reproved Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized, Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I have not heard of it until today. So Abimelech comes to Abraham and pretty much says, God is with you. I'm afraid of you. He has done a lot for you. Please don't hurt me and my kids. And by the way, this is my land that you're on, so just remember that. And Abraham says, yeah, I won't hurt you or your kids. And what's the deal? And Abimelech just wants to be sure that Abraham's going to be a good neighbor and not have his God, torch him. And then Abraham says, well, since we're making this covenant, by the way, your people have taken away one of my wells that I dug. And Abimelech's like, what? I didn't hear about this. Verse 27, so Abraham took sheep and oxen and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a covenant. Abraham set 7 ewe lambs of the flock apart. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs that you have set apart? And he said, these 7 ewe lambs you will take from my hand. That is, they may be a witness for me that I dug this well. This is very important stuff, the well, because they are in the southern region, the more dry, arid region, and you better have water. So you got to have a well. Remember, there's a good Bonanza episode where there's a drought and they don't have any water, and they're digging wells to try to get the water out of the ground. You got to have water if you're going to have flocks and if you're going to survive. And so this is very important just in the daily means of the story. And I think it also goes to show that nobody's making this stuff up, because this is just good old everyday survival stuff in the text, which I think is pretty cool. So Abraham wants the well back, and he offers these sacrifices to Abimelech. Say, hey, I'm not lying. Here, I'm giving you these sacrifices, this food for you, if you will, lambs and oxen. And I want my well back. And so they make a covenant. Verse 31. Therefore, that place is called Beersheba. Beer is the Hebrew word for well, and Sheba is the Hebrew word of swear. So it's the well of the oath, or well of the swear, because they're both there. Both of them swore an oath. The rest of the verse reads, verse 32. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. Then Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, rose up and returned to the land of the Philistines. So they were in the Philistine area before the Philistines had really become a prominent nation as in the days of Samuel and David. Verse 33, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the land of the Philistines. So Abraham has so far sojourned in Egypt, and he's sojourned among Abimelech in the land of the Philistines. And he's also sojourned in other parts of the land of Israel. So he's moving around. And why is he moving around? Probably, number one, weather patterns. He's got a lot of cattle. He's got to find food for them. And second, also based on treaties and his neighbors. And where he was before, remember, Sodom and Gomorrah just got destroyed, and that land is probably really messed up right now. So that's probably why he moves south, which is probably not the best land, but it's the land to go to. There's probably, if he goes north, remember the 5 kings that he ambushed, they're north. So he probably doesn't want to go that direction. So he moves south because they're friendlier people, and he can make treaties with them as well. So that's sort of what happens in chapter 21. It sets us up with the birth of Isaac for now about 13 or 14 years after that, where we probably have the most important chapter in all of Genesis next week. Chapter 22, the sacrifice of Isaac, which I think in Jewish tradition is also known as probably the most important chapter in the entire Old Testament. So it's a phenomenal text. It's probably the most written about text of the Old Testament. It's called the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. It's in Hebrew. So we will check in with chapter 22 next week. Thanks for joining us today. Have a blessed, warm day. Eat some tomato soup or chicken noodle soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. And read your Bible and pray. And things will be good. At least blessed. Take care.